Okay, I'm just going to jump in with kind of a no bullshit, no hang up. I mean, I might have to um, reserve my thought, trying to make certain that I'm, tiptoeing through the words and the expressions properly as to exchange and convey my thoughts on this matter. But it seems like there is a plague of Platonists and a plague of essentialists that are hypocritical in certain respects. Like one of them suggests that one should not be able to gather um, the details from contemporary philosophy that are indicative of past philosophies. They say, no, you need to start back at the beginning. What makes them hypocritical, though, is that they'll try to shovel in some 19th century philosophers like Schopenhauer or Nietzsche, or some sort of get a survey course from other people, like heavy survey courses, little tidbits, anecdotes, or factoids about authors without reading the authors. And there's nothing wrong with secondary sources. There's nothing wrong with gathering those types of things, but nonetheless, they will read contemporary philosophies that do in fact inform them that or that their philosophy. And this has become culminated in other people in terms of the formalism and kind of the policing of the house of Western philosophy as a formal, like, crystalline castle structure that's running parallel against the formalism in programming, in coding, right? And so there's this appeal amongst the multitudes of seemingly infinite data that goes beyond all of us, that we are able to assess or access, that there's this need by some people to bring their minds or attempt to bring other people's minds back to what they believe are foundational thought essentials in philosophy. And um, and I don't want to outrightly attempt to condemn the idea that people shouldn't um, that they shouldn't learn a certain order to philosophy in kind of a first things first manner. Um, and maybe it took reading contemporary philosophies that they could relate to more, or accessing the multitude of data that informed them to do that. Yet the appeal to contemporary position seems to be a problem. So this is in one manner a response video to um, uh, let's say, find the margins once again of uh, the margins of singulitude, the margins of the monad, the margins of the one, the margins of our idea of essential form, right? As the idea of a oneness, once understood, you could see how it relates and carries into a dyad, and then a triad, and then a quad, etc. And that one could see that through well, through the course of starting with categorical singularities, that then one gets to make comparison from those singularities. Now, my whole basis of disagreement has to do with paying direct attention to my personal subjective phenomenological perspectival state, and what has been, um, if you will, granted to me, if you would like, or just observed and attended to by myself, as far as a witnessing. And I'm not suggesting that anybody else has this phenomenological state, although I would find it peculiar if they hadn't. And this particular state has something to do with like the waking of your gooey eye in the morning. It has to do with the idea of non-focus, initial non-focusing, a malaise, if you will. And I've often appealed to the prelingual infant. The prelingual infant is in a Disneying, blurry, and non-categorically self-defined space of just the organism being before it matures into language. This is always the most fuzzy state, right? So you'll get people that are talking about harmonies that are reflective of mathematical orderings and how all of this goes back to the idea of the essential one and the harmonies that spring forth from not claims of truth, but more like descriptions of truth. And then this underscores the idea that humanity before coinage and before modern arithmetic that coincides with coinage, and then you have you know the 5th century BC Grecian Plotinus, Pythagoras. You have a group that then is culminated, and then it moves in through the Socratic Aristotelian thought processes, right? The bases for the progeneration of Western philosophy, right? Um, the idea that Pythagoras and the mathematical forms, deriving first initially from probably the age when humanity had coinage, and then hence there needed to be some arithmetic of addition or subtraction that was brought into the cultural mind of the people that didn't, prior to that, have an idea of money or exchange, because the cities and the bartering, or the hunter-gatherer to bartering groups of strangers in cities, had not yet culminated on the planet, as far as my understanding of history, right? And so the culmination of money and arithmetic would have yielded a um, would have yielded the basics for mathematics. And then you could talk about conjunctive geometries. And once you have geometries, then you have theories on form and theories of harmony, right? In Egypt, in the Great Pyramids, apparently there are pools. Even though I've been there, I never entered the queens and kings chambers of Khufu or Khafre, but apparently there's sand pots that where it's suggested that the pyramidical architecture of the pyramids had some sort of harmonic play on the shape of the sands and or of the waters within the pyramid at different times, which would show an expression of physics relative to harmonic patternings, right? And so I went ahead and I drew that as like a shape, right? A harmonic patterning. And the idea of humans recognizing vibrations in water and patternings probably predated arithmetic. People woke up probably with more of a rudimentary non-recursive language, but way back in the day, because they didn't need to evolve within a culture that required sophisticated, psychostructures of being able to maintain an idea of what a quantity of coinage was, or something, the idea of trying to do comparative natural observances with conceptual observances, like that psycho-technology embedded within the culture and raised within the culture yields these comparisons. But once again, this comes down to, and the reason I brought, naming this way is because I constitutively hold an inverted position to what is promulgated, and I believe that it's essential actually for quote unquote a greater hyper faith, and yet there is this instinct of people to want, I think, and I don't want to say an instinct of people, an instinct of contemporary people, that when things become too confused, there's too much of a bricoleur or a mosaic in thought, a splintered mosaic in thought, right, that they can only keep track of so many things in their head, right? Now, and some people said, well, Einstein could keep track of 7 things in his head, right? And anyway, so let's say there's 5 things, right, that you're trying to keep in your head and you're ricocheting amongst them. And then there's 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? Then there's 7 things, right, that one can keep track of in their head. Now, imagine that it's your job, though, to allow things to attempt to segment or fragment these 2 different shapes. Let's say you needed to take care of 12 items in thought. So you might have to break off and segment yourself away from this in order to bring a constellation of meaning for several dispersed data sets as to coalesce in your mind and make sense. I don't expect everyone to understand or follow what it is I'm saying in this video, by the way, but I'll do my best to dumb it down and state things more generally or coherently, such that even if I'm speaking about this, like a monad, that you guys can have a handle on it by running a tangent around it, right? So anyway, let me get to, once again, my base presumption that out of a blurry state, or our organism starts out of a decoherent state or an incoherent state. It's not decoherent because it's not yet coherent, right? And so the idea that initial geometry and essences of shape are reduced to rudiments such as the triangle and the circle, right? Which, first off, were more than likely designed in sand or scratched in some ephemeral thing before it was carved into stone, or the wheel was made, something to that effect. And so these are considered like minimal bases of geometry that one could speak of a categorical geometric outline of the most simple item, right? And this item would be an item of oneness, or the monad, right? And from there you would have dyads and triads and quads, etc. And so my notion, right, my instinct, my belief is that these ideas are secondary, actually, to much more shaky line ideas in human conceptual formation of the phenomena of an individual learning. Now, once again, I'm not going to speak on how all human minds work, but there's once again this predominating idea that that a child doesn't first learn in a series of not yet coherent um, pattern recognition, almost as if the eye of focus is not necessarily an eye of focus on the outline of things or a oneness of things, but that the act of focusing allows one to exact, it allows the precursor for the mind to follow and exact an item in space, right? But my suggestion is actually kind of like seeing a drip in water or seeing a multitude of data that is not yet coherent. That you might be, like I said, starting a precursor, an approach to a basic monad, a basic categorical comparative distinction of an object relative to its background, right? And then at that point you can start talking about what some things are, if said things as objects are important in that community of language speakers. Prior to that, the idea would be something like a tree. A tree, not a tree, it's not even a metaphor for a tree, but some of the first witnessings of the human would be something perhaps like a pinus tree that one could say has a particular shape. This intuitive backdrop in a pre-Greek, prehistoric peoples to first see a mountain, right, and draw it maybe like that, right, or a tree that gives some indication, some information that does not necessarily parallel what we now conceive of as a pure triangle, right? Or when I say a pure triangle, meaning the definition of a triangle. And yet where we scrape away from the essence, wait, let me see if I can complete that thought. Because once again, it's not a deficit to be scattered. It's not even a deficit to run beyond your scattered limits, meaning to skiz one's mind too much, to gather more data, to expand one's bandwidth of apprehension. There may be something that appears to require like a split-mindedness, a correlation of how one aspect of your brain might be speaking to another aspect of your brain that might be found through historic uses of hallucinogens, or if you wanted to hypotheticalize on how humans had an increase of layered concepts that they could compare and contrast and evolve with one another, such that that we could generate geometric form as primary units, such as the triangle, right? And so basically, this is almost like a chicken or an egg argument, and I'm suggesting that the appeal to the Platonic forms, if you will, or the appeal to the geometric solids, if you will, the appeal to geometric thinking, right, is secondary. It's not primary, it's secondary. What came first was an incoherence, right? And that brings us back to contemporary philosophy. That brings us back to people that are analyzing what is it that the object of focus is in contrast to, that then would allow somebody else, like a parent or somebody that's bringing you into the language, to ascribe the object and grant it definition, and then to speak on and share its components, its descriptions, right? Some people think this is inherited in just by virtue of being human, and they don't see how humanity, or maybe it's passed through genetics at this point in some fashion, but still I think it's like either you're autistic or you would not be able to engage in discourse if you were not mentally capable of being educated within an arithmetical and categorical and language description, recursive language description community. Sorry. Okay, too many ricochets. So let me just reel this back. Chapter 2. Um, even the idea of a circle, right? Even the idea of a circle could is witnessed in something created by my man like that. It's a pretty good circle, right? Even though I'm not going to dump my coffee out showing you that oval, and you presume that it would turn into a circle. The idea of initial circles never being perfect. I don't even believe computers with pixelated windows can, properly, even with vector graphics, run perfect, quote unquote, absolutely perfect circles. There would always be one digit off. And so, because even our concept of a perfect circle, concept, if we close your eyes, as Derrida calls what you see as your mind's eye, in your mind's eye, the signified, right? You're signifying something in your mind, right? Even if you believe that you can imagine a perfect circle or imagine a triangle in your mind, then the variability of between people as to the orientation of, let's say, a triangle in one's mind, and let's say the width of the line, the color of what it is in their mind they're contrasting, these could all be very variable and hence not singular. Once again, it's by definition, by descriptive articulative definition, that a triangle is a triangle. But each human organism, from the signified state, after understanding the shape of a tree or the shape of a mountain or the shape of a triangle, has no, there is no internal rule that matches the definition of a triangle that one is seeing in their head that necessarily connects with something outside. It's definitionally considered the case. Like, think of a triangle, and then you say, okay, I am. Now, who am I to doubt that, right? If I say, think of a perfect circle, and then you might be more willing, if I said now, you might be more willing to doubt that you were able to even conceive of a perfect circle. You're only perceiving an approximation, something that you think is adequate to, right? Adequate to being able to speak then publicly with other people and just say, it's good enough for the government, it's close enough, it's perfect enough. Like, I couldn't imagine a more perfect circle in my head. Nonetheless, like Wittgenstein showed, there's no external rule to measure that external component shared in public language with the internal imagined component. So in certain cases, just the rotation of a spiral, right, or the rotation of the cup forward to move from oval to circle, right, is like, or rotating a spring so that you're only going to see the edge of the spring. You don't see the circle as a spiral outside of that orientation. So this sort of variable self consideration, the realizing that you're part one in one Zen in a unified field with everything, because you are part of everything, matches what one might start with, kind of like a unified self theory that then drives them through the sake of utility to want to not have their minds scattered, to have things reduced to like an Occam's razor, or the most simplified version of things. Why? For utility's sake, strictly for utility's sake. To get stuff done and get it done faster is to simplify these things. But the idea that one actually believes the the idea of essential definitions that are without variance or variability. When one comes to believe that, I think that that is actually a pathology of wanting to make and utilize a sense of utility in their being, in their life. They need to get shit done. They need to simplify everything as much as they can so that they can accomplish more, raise their kids, coordinate ideas, right? STEM, right? So they have this idea, like in school now, they have STEM, science, um, technology, engineering, and math, I think is what they call the STEM topics. But STEM is also the metaphor for stemming away from a branch, right? You're stemming, you're pointing back to the stem, to the root, right? And so this is also an appeal to education. It's an appeal to first things first. Let's start with the ancients and we'll work our way up. Well, guess what? There's too many authors, not too many authors for any human to get through. But there is so much development from the base over time that to choose and pick and cherry pick the authors, the books that you think are relevant and of interest, becomes almost accidental, right? You're either going to follow somebody else's prescribed reading list, or you'll accidentally back into an author and find their relevance where other people might have, you're reading authors that are not within, I guess, what would be considered the more primary authors through the philosophical Western tradition and canon of philosophy, right? And so because people back into those philosophies, there's this notion that one cannot presume the makeup of the stem by learning the constituent components of the phantasm of beliefs on the end, right? There's a presumption that the leaves do not inform the branches of the tree, that they are sourced from a stem, in other words, meaning to read a plethora of contemporary philosophy, some people will argue, will not inform you at all of the root or the base of the tree. I think that there are enough people that are contemporaneously writing that can mirror back and reflect, like reading secondary authors or secondary books on the pre-Socratic and try or any secondary authorship, auxiliary authorship. Once again, getting a handle on a category. Okay, chapter 3. Call that a blurry second dot, right? Okay, I need to zigzag back to the further point and then try to wrap things up a little bit more. The idea of finding like bark on a tree, like if you cut a tree and you had a cylinder and you had bark on that tree, you could peel the bark off the tree. Now the tree or the piece that you have is composed of the central and it's composed of the exterior and it's composed of the bark. And there is some navigation to get to the center by peeling first off the bark, right? to peel, to get to the center of a tree, one must, from a side instead of top down, leaf down. One would enter by first peeling off the bark. The bark itself, let me run a meta on this, right? A transpositional characterization or a bridge metaphor, right? So hold the idea first of pulling off the exterior bark to get to the center of the stem, right? That's more of my angle of where I'm coming from philosophically, instead of doing a top-down leaf to stem comparison, a chronological requirement that's already hypocritically abused by the person that's recommending it, right? There's this appeal that to get to the center of this, not a Tootsie Roll, but to the center of this cylinder, that one is able somehow to achieve it without first going through the bark or cutting through the bark, right? So there's a marginal outside, right? Now, let's say that one wants to speak of the tree as an essence, the tree as an essence. And God, how to put, it's gonna, it's not even a loss of thought. I think what it is that kind of where my mind goes in this case is not in monologue form. That it's part of being able to discuss the topic requires an interlocutor and a dialogue, because some of what I'm speaking appears within a dialogic framework where I'm able to have a sounding board of a comparison contrast in which to invoke my response, and then I can elucidate better on why it is that an attempt at inquiring into the essence of something ironically requires like an attempt at de-essentializing it. By that, it's like the idea of two ones being a dyad or two-ness compared to the oneness is in a way probably viewed by pre-arithmetical humans as something like a mom giving birth to twins, or a mom giving birth to more than one kid, things that stem from one that are pluralized, right? They're not singularized. Anti-essentialism, I guess what I'm suggesting is it comes along with an internal irony that in order to know what is essential, one cannot have it in a vacuum. One must have had to find something like an inductive quality of multiple things, multiple trees, multiple cups, multiple standardization of a greater category to compare to the units within said set or said category. Like of all pine trees, let's look at one pine tree, right? Something like that. To get to the center of the log, one must first remove or observe or go through the exterior marginal excesses that have developed as protection around said quote unquote tree or stump, the essence of tree, the essence of the center, like as a geometrical concept. Okay, how do I take the I have a now I'm moving to another notion. I have this friend, and he appeared very autistic earlier because he would do such exercises, and now he's quite a brilliant mathematician and router engineer. That he took his mind in this way, and he was quite informative to me in a lot of ways, in terms of like variable datum sets and statistical data sets and variance amongst data sets and plot structures and whatnot. But it at the end, it's kind of like See, now I'm already zagging to chapter 4. Like, how am I going to do this? How am I going to do this without dialogics? Like, there's certain people, even with the coronavirus, and pardon that I'm eating this, it's my nervous habit while I'm contemplating how to shift yet again to see whether or not I can shift back and hold this conceptually together and convey it to you guys without, becoming too lost in the weeds, because that's not the goal. The goal is to start off as uncoherent and develop coherence, right? Too many tangents. Okay, so for example, I wrote a book on contradiction, right? Trying to talk about square circles and married bachelors and things that are contrary and not a formalized contradiction, A and not A, right? Those sort of things. But I also ran through like a greater harmony through the text that only people that are willing to suffer through the difficulty of the text would possibly see as having a melodious, almost, let's say, octave harmony that one could see through the writing if one was to open up and view the writing like an accordion, right? It would help them see how it is I was navigating a general overarching tone to the book, as to not only supply the content of the book as being exceptions to held notions of non-contradiction, putting that in people's face, or contradiction in people's face, while at the same time giving something like a harmony, and by including that harmony along with the content, it was to elucidate actually a dissonance. So the whole idea of the text was to add a dissonant quality alongside, parallel with contradictory thinking, right? And then to re-metaphorize things like logical explosion, or to contain concepts of logical explosion through further metaphor, right? So, and that's on Amazon. Anyone can download it, and if you can get through it, fine. I think I got 3 out of 5 stars, and to me, that's actually better than a 5, because I would assume there's more people that wouldn't get through it, or find it difficult, or find it belaboring, or find it uninteresting, right? And they would chalk up my mind as not being a proactive contribution to what I think are not explored ideas that were inspired by Derrida and Wittgenstein, and some of the more 20th century difficult authors that I believe, like the Leaves, had well echoed back, through. And I mean, there's several authors that they're great. But anyway, not to go here, but perhaps I won't get to the even the 5-pointed star, unless I just say, okay, this is chapter 5. That last comment was chapter 4. Derrida's of Grammatology, I think it's his best text. And then he was, through discussing language and discussing deconstruction, right? Processes. He came up with the idea of trying to collapse a dyad into a monad, right? To destabilize it, right? And this particular functionality had to do something with accepting first the binaries that are found within language, or the dichotomous language of up, down, left, right, in, out, good, bad, et cetera, right? And so he would say something like, is life a part of death, or is death a part of life, right? And so in order to answer a question like that, one has to then not categorize a totality of what life is or what death is per se, but maybe generalize it, run a tangential thought along it to suggest, right, that life is a type of death, right, and that type of description would be a description of the organic or unorganic chemistry that in different combinatorial patternings and complexities developed life, but at root you're dealing with inorganics and hence non-life, and one would say non-life is akin to death. And so one could say if life was a type of death or death was a type of life, which would be more primary, you would couple one within another, and that was his base root of deconstruction, period. Anything else about a dismantling or decomposition or the way people use like the term surreal to just mean anything wackadoodle, abusing the word. Like this is, deconstruction is just used abusively since he coined the term. The other thing had to do with difference and difference, to defer and to find difference. And so Derrida began this quality once again of observing, like Wittgenstein studying languages, coming down to the idea of games in language, right? But the idea that and certainly there's even more complex games. I attempt to play more complex games with my linguistics than other people do. But the first difference that Derrida was pointing out was between the phone, the phonic, and the representation of what it is I'm referencing to you, just via my words, as opposed to the graphic, right? There's Donahue. Donahue critiques the crap out of Derrida. He's one of my best read critiques. Very, very solid critique. But basically, what Derrida suggests is he suggests that there's this huge breach, and I haven't read Donahue in a while because I'm on to Steiner, by the way. See how I'm zigzagging in my thinking. It appears non-pull togetherable by the audience often. They give up, they abandon listening because it becomes too hard. Their mind intuits a sense of desire towards simplicity, straightforwardness, utility. Nonetheless, okay, so Derrida splits the grapheme or the graphic, right, the font, if you will, and the meaning that is the referent, and then the phonic, right? And so he spells different and difference. The difference between the two is actually spelled the same. Difference and difference. Difference and difference, right? And so you can add the apostrophe at the end for that verbal description of what difference is, referring to the phonic, and then in the textual you add the apostrophe at the end, right? And yet nonetheless he's talking both about difference of things, difference, like I said, the difference between imagining a pyramid or imagining a circle and then stating it or speaking on it or agreeing on it or agreeing with what the definition or the essence is, comes into play, right? The difference between the referent and the sign, the mental image, right, is a type of difference that is different than the phonic grapheme difference, the eyes closed meditated difference, than the pointing to items in the empirical world that are triangular or triangles or circles or essentially said singular items, right? This awareness of Derrida to bring in a calculus of the phenomenological state, one's relationship with their mind, their internal composition of their mind, and their coordination and ordination, their means of knowing how to speak and how to use a lexicons in order to accomplish utility in their life, right? Now, the goal is to not get caught up in your life in a swamp of non-productivity and non-direction, right? So the idea of causing dissonance, or what it is I'm trying to convey, is just more like, look, don't fucking fool yourself to think that Plato's got it all in the bag, right? And that he's the root and truth starts there, and base geometry is base, and because the way education and curriculum is ordered, that somehow the great minds of the past that have spoken or produced artifacts and architecture and histories and music and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, are not popped up throughout time and are not necessarily needed to be coalesced in order of chronology, right? Like that was a fundamental, I want to call it a salesman technique, and it's kind of a lie. It's kind of a lie. And I pointed out the hypocrisy earlier already on this. Now, so, okay, now we'll go to chapter 5. I might have to start back to chapter 4. And then we'll end there. Required de-coherence. See, I'm not, even my title isn't going to suffice. I might have to run another video, or once again, skip to the 7-pointed star and recalibrate my angle of expression relative to you guys, as if I'm another person that's now juggling 7 balls instead of 5, right? And the notion that the shoreline of one's knowledge is bumped into a greater shoreline of one's ignorance, let's say, as a truism, right? That being said, the idea of trying to simplify or generate a notion of one's relationship with the gods, that God and logic and numbers, that numbers and logic somehow are divine, because humans can conceive such patterns and conceive such geometries and shapes and do such fabulous things, that at some point it's related or attributed to aspects of the gods historically. And my belief is the shoreline of one's ignorance would require eventually that all coherences, when one imagines the triangle now, let's say you're concretized on a circle and a triangle as rudimentary, geometric, categorical outlines or monads or metaphors of such things, of one another. That the idea that when one falls asleep and now the triangle in one's mind is a reflection of a wave in water, one might lose a sense of the required definitional properties of said state, and still allow themselves to call something that might look like the tree a little bit more, right, if you will, like in a water pattern, and say that's a triangle, right? Here's another idea, right? Triangle. If I just do this, right? Is that a triangle? Would you say, let me do this instead, it'll help for contrast's sake. So here's the idea, right? If I do that, right, is that a triangle? One might say, no, those are 3 disparate dots, because look, now you got 4 disparate dots, right? Then you got ideas of, oh, any perpendicular, parallelogram you can make a triangle out of, right? So then you say that's a triangle. Well, okay, but that's not even a computer generated line. Look at the bow on that thing. Look at the marginal error of what you're calling a triangle, right? And so in a book on contradiction, the idea that the definition of a triangle has to somehow fulfill this historic definition would be erroneous and a lie to how human language functions. Not how comparative concepts and the idea of formalized exactitude of concepts function. It's not that. But it would be an overstepping, an overlooking, and hence a de-spiritualization or a stepping away from the divine to bullshit oneself into believing that the human ever approximates a perfect circle, or that even a computer with all of its digits wouldn't. You can keep emphasizing it all you want. Oh, look at that circle. Look at that circle, 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 circle. That's a circle. That's a monad. That's a category. It's got an internal that's comprised with comparative aspects that are external to it, whatnot, right? It'd be a type of delusion. So this is what I meant by I'm trying to add not merely a dissonance, but to call bullshit and say, look, de-coherence and anti-essentialism are not only primary, meaning that they came first and that they can easily go away as soon as your mind moves into a periphery outside of the topic and comes back into the topic. Unless you still have a mind that when someone says triangle, your mind just maps it. You know it, you think it, and that somehow if I just showed you that, you wouldn't, you would immediately only see triangles in there, right? You couldn't see non-triangles in there, something of that case. So anyway, so the exceptions to the triangle rule have something to do with this. All right, so let me try to point this out. Okay. So there we go, right? So it's not three angles and three lines, it's just three angles. Now, is that a triangle? Does your mind fill in the gap? If I add these intercessory lines, does it colloquially now qualify as a triangle? Would you not call it a triangle? If I put a dot in the center instead of these lines, well, the lines are already there. Now we'd be talking about a counterfactual modal possibility, right? So anyway, so there's that idea. Here's another triangle. Can I say, look at that triangle, right? Colloquially, without bullshitting yourself, de-essentialize your notions of what a triangle, and you just grant that over. That's a triangle, right? So there's kind of this confluence, and there's this kind of contrasted register between the not merely the colloquial use and the like relieving yourself of the exactitude of what a definition of a triangle is, of three sides that are of three sides and three angles that intersect, right? Because once again, the idea isn't merely to contrast the colloquial with that, right? So we stellate the lines here, right? Now do we have a triangle? Are we going to find the large exactitudes of triangles here? Meaning, does that now disqualify as a triangle? Is that a TP and its reflection? Right. So then one could question once again the most rudimentary of claimed shared conceptual geometric frames, and even the idea of justifying the one relative to the oneness, or one and the monad, or twos and the dyad, two is still quantitative, you're quantizing, but the dyad is about a dualism. It's about a held dualism, right? So it's like I said, it's not just colloquial versus formal. It's interpretive nuances. Are you talking about a circle, right? Or are you talking about a? Oops, I just clicked something on the camera. So hopefully you hear. Or are you talking about this satellite? And by the way, Faith, I won't read or care to read your comments any further. Are you talking about a rotation around to define a circle, right? Are you talking about the handle, right, and the rotation that defines a circle, like the brush that the artist holds, right? Something to that effect. Or are you trying to talk about a circle generally? Now, Derrida also brought up the idea that the totality of a thing is found outside of a thing. And that can be read in a couple or several ways if one would like, right? So the totality of the circle, like I said, could be found by speaking about how I outline the circle with a tangential line. The tangential line is found outside of the circle. And so the totalizing of a thing requires that one contrast it with its background and totalize it. Okay, so now we're done with that. And then I'm just like, I'll probably have to do a part 2 about one's relationship with kind of like a loss of meaning. The idea of the meaning landscape being like a human phenomenon that collapses. It's only for the living, if you will. Only for those that process, that do close their eyes, that do dream, that do have peripheries, that do open their mouth, that do speak, that do have brains and stems and organism that inform their health and their tonal properties and qualities and their lingual abilities and so forth. In any case, the required, like I said, the part 2 will be this. So, in summary, the idea of finding the divine, like to access the divine, requires, from my experience, not only a recoherence post de-coherence, that one must allow themselves to recognize the non-essentialisms, non-definitive grounding, right? To allow their mind to splinter out to the domain of that which is where one is more ignorant. Put it this way, logic isn't a property of God, right? Like, that's a human property that we believe because it's conceptual and it's divine, and there's something neat about being able to convey it and hold it as like a perennial thought, right? Then it's then given a divine quality. But to access the divine, one must dissolve, break, find de-coherence, find themselves within a muck, because that muck extends out into the shoreline of what one is more ignorant of. So it's like setting multiple boats or bottles out to ocean and then having them finally come back to sea. And this is the disjunct conjoiner between somebody that appeals to Plato or appeals to like grounding their thought and attempting to speak of the gods without accessing the gods, right? It's almost as if the Platonic forms got in the way of humans' access to God. And it's the contemporary job of quote unquote a dark education or a deconstructive education or a non-formal, disformal education. Like Bruce Lee, you learn the form and you remove the form. You become like liquid. You don't maintain the form. You don't crystallize and progenerate the prism of the form. Right. So it's a different approach to schooling and whatnot. But it is precisely that is needed to jump from this part of a pyramid to that part of a pyramid, right? So the point is that you'll find in all these philosophies that their philosophy actually ends at this point. They'll point to the divine. They're referencing this. But that gap, that leap, that thing that they think is because there's geometry and because there's a definition of a pyramid that points up, that somehow, even though they end there, and they know they end there, they imagine the spirit realm, the upper realm, the higher dimension. They don't until they themselves harmonize or make volatile within this and break side and rip the bark off and decohere the edges, spit it all out, will, in my history, along with bodily breaking, which might have quickened my destruction or possibly have lengthened it, nonetheless, I was able to take a fateful leap, and in contrast, both prior to the time of seeing an orb in 2007 and breaking myself in 2010 and getting God coming down and coming down into my world and presenting itself and guiding me, even like a legend in very specific directionality, that if one attunes, once one goes through this process and echoes categories with non-categories and dissonance with non-dissonance and abuses themselves away or disabuses themselves away from the utility of living a proper utilitarian, like help my children grow well, sort of like get good jobs and be smart and whatnot. As soon as one devolves that and sees prior to the arithmetical and the alphabetical human and the relationship with God, if you will, it's almost like Moses would be like an artifact of a previous world of thinking. And so in any case, once again, the pyramid, God came down, entered this limitation, hence because of a faith, a leap faith. That makes sense. Beyond that, most people will, like the elephant tied to a chain, learn the maintenance. They will never call this structure right here a square circle. I don't know why. Now it's convenient if I say, is that not a square circle, or is this pattern, without you seeing my progress of building, is that not a square circle, and is that not a square circle, right? The idea that one might want to run a colloquial definition, right, and say that's a square circle. The only retractor is to say, no, that's non-Euclidean, right? If you say that's a square circle, you're just being colloquial. We'll call that a squirrel or squirrel, something like that, right, as a joke, right? And that one's another form of a squirrel, right? And the idea of even how to draw it, something like that right, as a square circle. Sorry, doing it off here. Like these all qualify as square circles, but the reappeal back to a Euclidean definition of you cannot have a square circle, once again, is a required categorical acceptance. You don't have to accept it, but the appeal is to say, no, no, no. Well, no matter how many times you draw these are never square circles because those are impossible. Even though they're quite possible, look how possible they are. They're right here. Just like that is called a triangle, and that can be a triangle. Those can be square circles, right? But there's the appeal back to the Euclidean descriptions and definitions, right? So you're already pre-categorized on what the limitations were. And so a greater form of philosophy is to step beyond the elephant that has been trained, with a ball and chain, to not go beyond. And so a lot of these pre-Socratic, Platonic people that are hearkening back, I'm not trying to piss on them for doing it. Like, I get why they do that and why they think it's substantial. It's that I know that at one point, they're definitely lying to themselves because they are limited here and they don't meet the divine. And I don't know what else to say on that fact because the path is very narrow. So they say. But once again, yeah, you want to break free and quit internalizing the space and the centroid that holds the elephant in place, and instead don't raise the elephant on a ball and chain in the first place and try to make a virtue out of it. Thank you very much.